helpless, agony, humiliation. Please, don't touch me. I can't close my legs. The young woman's voice trembled in the dry Wyoming air. She lay twisted across the broken boards of a wagon in the middle of the prairie, her dress torn, her breathing shallow, her right leg bent at an angle no human body should ever hold. Dust clung to her skin. Blood had dried along her calf, and the tall grass around the wagon moved slowly under the evening wind. Whispering through the wide, empty valley of Medicine Bow, kneeling beside her was a man old enough to be her father. Broad shoulders, rough beard, hands as large as a blacksmith's. Those hands were gripping her leg. From a distance, anyone riding past would have believed the worst. And they would have been wrong. It looked exactly like a scene a town would never forgive. The girl tried to pull away, but the moment she moved, a scream tore out of her throat. Pain shot through her body so violently that her fingers clawed at the splintered wood beneath her. I can't move it, she whispered. The man studying her injury didn't look gentle. He looked like a mountain animal. Sunburned skin, dusty coat, eyes that had seen too many hard winters. His name was Gideon Blackwood. For 15 years, people across this part of Wyoming had whispered his name with suspicion. Some called him dangerous. Some called him a madman who chose to live alone in the mountains. Right now, none of those rumors mattered. Gideon leaned closer and spoke quietly. If I don't touch you, miss, you won't walk again. The girl froze. Her chest rose and fell in short, panicked breaths. Her leg had twisted badly at the hip. Gideon had seen injuries like this before, not on wagons, on battlefields. Years ago, he'd served as an army medic. He knew a hip like this had to be set fast, wait too long, and she might never walk right again. The girl looked at Gideon with wide, frightened eyes. She had no reason to trust him. All she saw was a stranger kneeling between her legs while she lay helpless in the dirt. Please, she whispered again. Don't. Gideon tightened his grip gently but firmly. This will hurt, he said. Only a moment. Her fingers grabbed his sleeve. Her body trembled. But Gideon had already placed one hand beneath her knee and the other against the bone of her hip. He waited 1 second. Then he pushed. A sharp crack echoed across the quiet prairie. The girl's scream shattered the stillness of the valley. Then suddenly her body went limp. The tension in her leg disappeared. Her head rolled back against the wagon board. She fainted. Gideon stayed still for a moment, breathing slowly. The joint had slipped back where it belonged. Carefully, he released her leg. The wind moved again through the tall grass. The prairie was silent, except for the distant cry of a hawk. As Gideon adjusted the torn fabric of her dress to keep the hip from shifting again, something else caught his attention. Bruises, old ones, along her ribs, across her arms, not from today's accident, and around her wrists were faint marks. Rope marks. Gideon's expression darkened slightly. This girl had not simply fallen from a wagon. Someone had been hurting her for a long time. He stood and looked at the broken axle of the wagon. At first glance, it looked like a normal accident. But Gideon had lived too long in rough country to miss details. The wood had not snapped naturally. The axle had been cut halfway through. Someone had weakened it before the wagon ever left the ranch. Someone had wanted it to break. Someone had wanted this girl stranded here, maybe dying slowly in the open prairie. Gideon looked across the distant hills where scattered ranch houses stood miles away. Somewhere out there was the man who had sent her here. And if that man found out what Gideon had just done, the story would not sound like a rescue. It would sound like something else entirely. And Gideon knew exactly how ugly that story could become. A young wife, a torn dress, a man from the mountains with his hands on her body. That was all a town like Laramie needed. No one would ask how badly her hip was twisted. No one would ask who cut the wagon axle. They would only ask one thing. What had Gideon Blackwood done to another man's wife out there in the grass? And once that question started moving, it would spread faster than truth ever could before the trail gets any darker. Just a quick word. This story is inspired by frontier accounts and carefully rewritten with a few added details to make the lesson clearer and the telling stronger. The images in this video are AI made to help bring the old frontier to life. If this kind of story is not for you tonight, get some rest and take care of yourself. But if old frontier stories still mean something to you, Stay with me. This one is only getting started. Back on the prairie. Gideon lifted the unconscious woman carefully into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. Too light for someone who should have been living on a comfortable ranch. Her head rested weakly against his shoulders. He carried her toward his horse. The stallion snorted but didn't move. Even the animal seemed to sense the fragile stranger. Gideon secured her across the saddle and tied a blanket around her to keep her steady. Then he glanced one last time at the broken wagon behind him, at the Kodak, at the empty road stretching across the grass. If the wrong people heard this story first, they would not say Gideon Blackwood had saved a woman's life. They would say something very different. They would say a mountain man had been found alone in the prairie with another man's wife, her dress torn, her legs forced open in the grass. And in Wyoming, when a town believed a woman's honor had been taken, men didn't wait for the truth. They brought rope. And that is where the real trouble began. Because when Victor Moore learned who had touched Adelaide that afternoon on the prairie, he was never going to tell people the truth. He was going to tell them what it looked like. And in Wyoming, what it looked like could get a man hanged long before the truth ever spoke. Gideon Blackwood had carried wounded men before, men twice his size, men bleeding out in the mud while cannons roared somewhere beyond the smoke. But the young woman across his saddle felt strangely fragile, too light, too quiet. Her head rested against the rolled blanket Gideon had tied behind the saddle horn, her dark hair brushing against the leather each time the horse stepped forward. The stallion moved slowly along a narrow trail that climbed toward the low mountains west of Medicine Bow. Gideon kept one hand steady on the reins and the other resting lightly near the girl's shoulder to keep her from slipping. The sun had begun to sink. Evening shadows stretched across the prairie. He needed to reach his cabin before nightfall. The mountains could grow cold fast after sunset, even in summer. The girl stirred once as the horse climbed a rocky slope. A faint groan escaped her lips. Gideon slowed the horse immediately. Her eyes opened halfway. For a moment she looked confused. Then the memory rushed back. Her body stiffened. She tried to move. The pain stopped her. Her breath caught in her throat. Easy, Gideon said quietly. You'll tear the joint again if you fight it. The girl blinked slowly, trying to focus. She realized she was lying across a saddle. The stranger from the prairie was leading the horse. Her voice came out weak. Where are you taking me? Someplace quiet, Gideon answered. My cabin. Her eyes widened slightly. For a second, fear returned. Gideon noticed it. He had seen that same look before in wounded soldiers who woke up not knowing who had dragged them from the battlefield. You could have died out there, he said calmly. I figured you'd prefer a roof. She studied him carefully. His voice wasn't cruel, just plain tired. Like a man who had lived alone too long. After a moment she spoke again. My husband will be looking for me. Gideon didn't answer right away, but he kept guiding the horse up the trail. The wind carried the smell of pine from the hills above. Finally he said something simple. Then your husband shouldn't have left you in a broken wagon. Gideon said it plain, not angry, said just certain. Silence followed. The girl turned her face away. A tear slipped quietly down toward her temple. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The trail curved upward into a narrow pass between two large rocks. Beyond it sat a small stone cabin tucked against the hillside. It was not much to look at. A single chimney, a small corral, a stack of chopped firewood leaning beside the door. But the place was solid. Storms had tried to tear it down many winters. The cabin was still standing. Gideon guided the horse inside the corral and tied the reins. Then he lifted the girl gently from the saddle. She gasped softly when her hip shifted. Sorry, Gideon said. That joint's going to complain for a while. He carried her inside. The cabin smelled faintly of pine smoke and coffee. The furniture was simple. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed near the back wall. Gideon laid her down carefully and placed a folded blanket beneath her injured leg to keep the hip steady. For a few seconds she simply stared at the ceiling. The quiet inside the cabin felt strange after the open prairie. Finally she spoke. My name is Adelaide. Gideon nodded once. Gideon. She looked toward him. You knew that already. He shrugged. Folks talk. Adelaide studied his face. You live out here alone, mostly. That answer seemed to surprise her. Most men in Wyoming lived near towns or ranches. Living alone in the hills meant something had pushed a man away from people. Adelaide slowly turned her head toward the small window beside the bed. The sun was almost gone. Orange light spilled across the mountains. For a moment she looked peaceful. Then Gideon noticed her hands. They were gripping the blanket tightly, as if she were bracing for something. "Your husband did those bruises," Gideon said quietly. It was not really a question. Adelaide closed her eyes. For a few seconds she said nothing. Then her voice came out barely above a whisper. "He said I was ungrateful." Gideon leaned against the wall near the stove. He had heard many excuses for violence in his life. That one was not new. Adelaide continued slowly. "My father left me land near the river," she said. "Victor and his father want it signed over." Gideon gave a small nod. Land and water, that was enough to turn decent men into animals out here. "You refused," he said. Adelaide lowered her eyes. That was answer enough. Outside, the last light faded behind the hills. Inside the cabin, the room grew darker. Gideon lit a lantern and set it on the table. Warm yellow light filled the small space. Adelaide watched him for a moment. "You didn't ask why I ran," she said. Gideon poured water into a kettle and placed it over the stove. "Didn't need to," he answered. She looked confused. He glanced back toward her. No one ends up alone in a broken wagon out there unless someone wanted them gone. The kettle began to warm. The cabin filled with quiet again, but far away across the valley another kind of silence was breaking. At a ranch house many miles from Gideon's cabin, a man named Victor Moore had just discovered something. His wife's wagon had been found empty. The axle had snapped. But Adelaide Moore was gone. Victor stood in the yard staring toward the distant mountains. Someone had taken her. Or worse, someone had helped her escape, and Victor Moore was not the kind of man who let people walk away with what he believed belonged to him. Back in the cabin, Adelaide slowly drifted toward sleep as the pain in her hip dulled. Gideon sat near the stove watching the lantern flame. He had a feeling the quiet would not last long. Men like Victor Moore didn't forget insult, and rumors traveled faster than horses across Wyoming. Sooner or later, someone would hear that Gideon Blackwood had been found alone with another man's wife in the prairie grass. And when that story reached town, people would not care about broken hips or cut wagon axles. They would only care about what it looked like, and what it looked like was trouble. What Gideon did not know yet was that Victor Moore had already started talking. And every mile that rumor traveled made Adelaide less like a wounded woman and more like a scandal. That was the danger now. Not the mountain. Not the dark. The story. And before the trouble reaches that mountain, take one small moment for me. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Then pour yourself a cup of tea, settle in, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and where you're listening from tonight. Because that quiet little cabin in Wyoming was about to lose its peace. By then, the night was doing what nights do in rough country. It was carrying stories farther than men could ride. Some were already false. Some were only half true. But by sunrise, most of the valley would no longer be asking whether Adelaide Moore was hurt. They would be asking what kind of man Gideon Blackwood really was. The mountains grew quiet after Adelaide finally fell asleep. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind that made a man listen. Gideon Blackwood sat beside the small iron stove, one boot resting against the floorboards. His chair tipped back slightly as he watched the lantern flame flicker. Outside, the Wyoming night had settled over the hills. Crickets had begun their steady rhythm. The wind moved through the pines above the cabin. Most men would have slept. Gideon didn't. Living alone in the mountains had taught him something simple. When trouble was coming, the night usually felt different. Tonight it did. He stood and stepped outside onto the small porch. The air was cooler now. The moon hung low over the dark prairie far below. From up here, a man could see miles of open land. Gideon rested his hands on the railing and studied the valley. Somewhere out there, a husband was already asking questions. Men like Victor Moore didn't wake up calm when their wife disappeared. They woke up angry, and angry men rarely rode alone. Inside the cabin, Adelaide stirred. The pain in her hip dragged her back toward consciousness. Her eyes opened slowly. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The wooden ceiling above her was unfamiliar. The lantern light was soft. Then the memory returned. The broken wagon, the prairie, the stranger kneeling beside her. Her breath caught for a moment, but the pain in her hip was different now. still sore, still tight, but not the unbearable twisting agony she had felt earlier. She shifted slightly. The joint held. Her eyes widened a little. He had fixed it. It still hurt badly, but it was no longer the kind of pain that trapped a person in the dirt. Adelaide slowly turned her head. Gideon was not in the room. For a brief moment, fear crept back into her chest. Then she heard the creak of the porch outside, footsteps, slow, heavy. The door opened quietly. Gideon stepped back inside. He noticed her watching him. "You stayed awake," he said. She hesitated before answering. "I thought maybe I was dreaming." Gideon poured a little water from the kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. She took it carefully. Her hands trembled slightly. "Thank you," she said. Gideon gave a small nod and sat down again near the stove. The silence between them lasted a few seconds. Adelaide studied the room again. Simple walls, neatly stacked firewood, a rifle resting above the door. Everything about the place felt steady, solid, nothing like the house she'd left behind. "You really live here alone?" she said quietly. "Most days." She watched him for a moment. "Don't you ever get lonely?" Gideon shrugged slightly. "Lonely is quieter than trouble." That answer made Adelaide almost smile. Almost. Then the thought of home returned. Her expression darkened. "They'll come looking for me," she said. Gideon didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "Your husband runs the Moore Ranch downriver," he said. Adelaide looked surprised. "Do you know him?" "I know the name. That name had weight in this part of Wyoming. Ranches depended on water, and Hiram Moore controlled more water rights than most men around here like to admit." Adelaide stared down at the cup in her hands. "My father trusted them," she said softly. "He thought they were honorable men." Gideon looked toward the door. A faint humor crossed his face. "Trust can be expensive out here." Adelaide took a slow breath. Then she spoke again. "They locked me in the cellar last winter." Gideon's eyes shifted back toward her. She kept talking, quiet, almost numb. "They said I needed time to think about signing the land over." Her fingers tightened around the tin cup. "I didn't sign." The lantern flame flickered between them. Gideon had heard enough stories like this to understand the rest. Land, water, power. Men had done worse things for less. "You were never supposed to leave that wagon alive," Gideon said calmly. Adelaide nodded once. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she held them back. "I know." The cabin fell quiet again. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled across the dark hills. Gideon stood and walked toward the small window. The valley below was mostly black now, but far away on the prairie a faint glow caught his eye. At first he thought it was moonlight reflecting off something, then the light moved, slow, steady. Lanterns, more than one. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. He counted them. 1, 2, 3. 4 riders at least. Maybe more behind them, riding straight toward the mountains. Adelaide noticed the change in his posture. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Gideon kept his eyes on the moving lights in the distance. They didn't waste much time. Her voice grew tense. "Who?" Gideon turned back toward her. "Your husband found the wagon?" Adelaide's face went pale. Gideon walked to the door and picked up the rifle resting above it. Not in a hurry, just steady. He checked the chamber with the calm habit of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Then he looked back at Adelaide. "Looks like Victor Moore brought friends." The lanterns in the valley were climbing the trail now, and if those riders believed the story, Victor Moore was already spreading across the county. They were not coming up this mountain to talk. They were coming for a man the town already suspected. A mountain man found alone with another man's wife in the prairie grass, and by the time those riders reached the cabin, one question was going to decide what happened next. Would Adelaide Moore tell the truth about the man who saved her life? Or would fear keep her silent long enough for a rope to find Gideon Blackwood first? The lantern's gamons kept moving up the mountain trail. Slow, steady. Too steady for men who were simply passing through. Gideon Blackwood stood beside the cabin door with the rifle resting loosely in his hands, watching the faint lights climb higher through the dark valley. He had seen this kind of thing before. A group of riders traveling together at night usually meant one of two things. Someone had died, or someone was about to, behind him. Adelaide shifted slightly on the bed. The movement sent a sharp ache through her hip, and she drew in a quiet breath. Gideon heard it. "Stay still," he said calmly. "They'll be close enough soon without you making that joint worse." Adelaide pushed herself up a little anyway, using her arms to brace against the wooden headboard. Her face had gone pale again. "How many?" she asked. Gideon glanced once more through the window. "4 I can see." He paused. "Maybe more behind them?" Adelaide swallowed. She already knew who those riders were. Victor Moore never came looking alone when he believed something had been taken from him, and Victor Moore believed a great many things belonged to him. Gideon stepped outside again and leaned against the porch railing, studying the trail below. The lantern lights were closer now, close enough that he could hear the faint rhythm of hooves on stone. Behind him, the cabin door creaked softly as Adelaide slowly slid her legs off the bed. The moment her injured hip took weight, she gasped. The pain was sharp but different now. The joint held. She gripped the edge of the table and forced herself upright. Gideon turned when he heard the chair scrape across the floor. He stepped back inside. "You should be lying down," he said. Adelaide shook her head. "If they see me hiding in your bed, they won't listen to anything I say." That was true. Men like Victor Moore didn't arrive with patience. They arrived with conclusions already made. Gideon studied her for a second. Then he nodded once. "Then stand near the door." She limped slowly across the cabin, every step careful. By the time she reached the door frame, sweat had broken across her forehead. The injury made her movement stiff, but she stayed on her feet. Outside, the riders were reaching the lower bend of the trail now. Their lantern light flickered across the rocks. Gideon stepped onto the porch again. He didn't raise the rifle. He simply waited. The riders came into view a minute later, 4 men, their horses breathing hard from the climb. At the front rode Victor Moore. Even in the lantern light, Gideon could see the anger in the man's posture. Victor pulled his horse to a stop 10 yards from the porch. The other riders spread out slightly behind him. Nobody spoke at first. The night air held the tension like a drawn wire. Victor looked at Gideon with cold eyes. Then his gaze shifted past him toward the cabin door. "You hiding my wife in there, Blackwood?" he asked. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man used to being obeyed. Gideon rested one shoulder against the porch post. "Your wife isn't hiding." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Then bring her out." Gideon didn't move. Behind him, the cabin door opened slowly. Adelaide stepped into the lantern light. Victor's expression flickered for a split second. Surprise, then anger rushed back twice as strong. "Adelaide," he said sharply, "what in God's name are you doing up here with him?" Adelaide gripped the door frame to steady herself. Her voice came out quiet but clear. "He saved my life," Victor laughed, a short, bitter sound. "That's not the story I heard." One of the other riders shifted in his saddle. Men in small Wyoming towns didn't ignore rumors about another man's wife, and the story spreading through the valley already sounded ugly. Victor leaned slightly forward in the saddle. "We found the wagon," he said. "Broken axle, empty road, my wife gone." His eyes moved slowly from Adelaide to Gideon. "And then someone rides into town saying they saw Gideon Blackwood kneeling between her legs in the grass." The other riders shifted again. That picture alone was enough to make tempers rise in a place like this. Adelaide's face flushed with anger. "He was fixing my hip," she said. "I was hurt." Victor shook his head slowly. "You expect these men to believe that—" He gestured toward the riders behind him. "They saw the wagon, too." Gideon spoke for the first time since the riders arrived. "The axle was cut," he said calmly. Victor's smile faded slightly. "What was that, the wagon axle?" Gideon repeated. "It didn't break. Someone cut it first." Gideon's eyes stayed on Victor. Both men knew he was telling the truth. For a moment, the night grew very quiet. Victor stared at him. Then he chuckled softly. "That's quite a story." He looked back at the other riders. "You hear that, boys? Now Gideon's the victim. Is he—" One of the men shifted in his saddle again. Even he seemed uncertain now. Adelaide took a step forward despite the pain in her hip. "My husband left me there," she said. Victor's head snapped back toward her. "You should be careful what you say." His voice had changed now, colder. more dangerous. Adelaide met his eyes. You locked me in the cellar all winter, she said. You beat me when I refused to sign the land papers. The riders behind Victor exchanged uneasy glances. Those were accusations that could not be laughed off so easily. Victor's jaw tightened. Then he slowly reached down and rested his hand on the grip of his revolver. The movement was small, but Gideon saw it immediately. The mountain man straightened slightly on the porch. His rifle lifted just enough to make the message clear. Nobody had fired a shot yet, but the night had turned thin and sharp. Victor looked from Gideon to Adelaide again. Then he smiled. You still spent the night in another man's cabin. That was all he needed to say. Because in places like this, a lie that sounded shameful could outrun the truth before sunrise, and that was the part Adelaide understood with sickening clarity. Victor did not need to prove anything tonight. He only needed to stain her name and Gideon's together long enough for decent men to start acting like fools. Once that happened, ropes came easier than questions. She was standing there on one good leg, hurting, shaken, and suddenly realizing that Gideon had not only saved her life, he had just stepped into the ruin meant for her. Victor's hand stayed near his revolver. He did not draw. He did not need to. The threat was already there in his voice, in his smile, in the way the other riders watched and waited. Gideon stood on the porch without moving. His rifle stayed low, but no one there doubted he was ready. Then Victor laughed softly. I rode all the way up here thinking I'd find a fight, he said, but maybe I won't need one. One of the men behind him shifted in the saddle. Victor, he said carefully, maybe we should hear the woman out. Victor didn't even look at him. Instead, he kept his eyes on Gideon. You think that matters? He said. Town already knows what happened. That sentence landed harder than any threat. Adelaide felt the air leave her lungs. What do you mean the town knows? She asked. Victor smiled again. Broken wagon. Missing wife. Mountain man living alone in the hills. He shrugged slowly. Stories travel fast. Gideon understood exactly what Victor was doing. He had shaped the story before riding up the mountain. Adelaide gripped the doorframe tighter. You told them he hurt me, she said. Victor gave a small shrug. I told them what it looked like. That was enough in a place like Laramie. A shameful rumor could do the rest on its own. Adelaide's face flushed with anger. He was fixing my hip, she said again. Victor looked at her like she had said something childish. That's your story. Gideon spoke calmly from the porch. The axle was cut. Victor rolled his eyes slightly. You already said that. Gideon didn't raise his voice. Someone wanted that wagon to break. Victor's smile disappeared completely now. For the first time, the conversation had moved somewhere he didn't like. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle. You got proof of that. Gideon didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone there understood the truth of the situation. Proof didn't matter tonight. Victor straightened again and looked back toward the other riders. Then he shrugged casually. Doesn't really change much anyway. He looked directly at Adelaide again. You still spent the night up here? No one answered him. But Gideon could feel the riders leaning the wrong way. In a place like this, that was danger enough. Adelaide took another careful step forward despite the pain in her hip. You left me there, she said. Victor's eyes flashed. I told you to stay in the wagon. It was broken, she replied. You broke it. Victor's jaw tightened. The men behind him exchanged another uneasy glance. That was not the story Victor had told in town. Gideon noticed that. He also noticed something else. One of the riders behind Victor looked particularly uncomfortable. Older than the others, gray beard, weathered face. The man shifted in his saddle again before finally speaking. Victor, he said slowly, you didn't mention nothing about cutting the wagon axle. Victor turned sharply toward him. You calling me a liar? Hank. Hank lifted both hands slightly. I'm just saying the woman looks like she's been through something. Victor laughed harshly. Oh, she has. He pointed toward Gideon with his chin. Spent the whole evening with our friend Blackwood. Adelaide felt anger rising inside her chest, stronger than the pain in her hip. You locked me in the cellar for weeks, she said loudly. You beat me when I refused to sign the land papers. This time the silence that followed was heavier. Even Victor's smile faded for a moment. The riders behind him shifted again. Nobody liked hearing about a man beating his wife, even in rough country. Victor recovered quickly. His voice grew colder. You sound confused. Adelaide stared at him. You tried to kill me. Victor leaned back in the saddle slowly. Careful now. Then he looked back toward Gideon again. You see what you've done. He gestured toward Adelaide. You filled her head with stories. Gideon said nothing. He had learned long ago that men like Victor Moore didn't lose control easily. They lost control when they felt cornered. Victor rested his hand on the revolver again. Here's what's going to happen, he said calmly. You send my wife down that trail with us. His eyes locked on Gideon. And maybe this ends without trouble. The lanterns flickered in the night wind. Gideon studied Victor for a moment. Then he spoke slowly. Adelaide can choose where she goes. You don't own the truth just because you shout first, Gideon said. His voice stayed calm, but there was iron in it now. Victor laughed again. That cold laugh returned. You still don't understand how things work around here. He leaned slightly forward in the saddle. She's my wife. Then his voice dropped into something darker. And you, he glanced toward the other riders, are the man the whole valley already believes dishonored her. The words hung in the air like the snap of a rope, because if Victor Moore was telling the truth about one thing, it was this. By morning, half the county would be repeating the same story, and once enough men believed that story, they wouldn't ride up the mountain to argue. They would ride up with a rope. Gideon Blackwood knew something Victor had forgotten. A lie could build a hanging fast, but the truth, once it started moving, could break a man just as hard. The word rope lingered in the cold mountain air. Nobody moved for several seconds. The horses shifted under their riders, snorting softly as the wind brushed across the hillside. Gideon Blackwood stood on the porch with the rifle resting across his hands, his face calm but his eyes sharp. He had seen this kind of moment before, a lie hanging in the air. Men deciding whether they believed it. Victor Moore was watching the same thing unfold. He could see the hesitation in the other riders. That bothered him. Victor had expected anger. Quick anger. The kind that made men act before thinking. Instead, he was seeing doubt. So he decided to push harder. You boys know how this works, Victor said, raising his voice slightly. A man found alone with another man's wife in the middle of nowhere. He looked back toward Gideon. What do you usually call that? No one answered. The older rider Hank shifted in his saddle again. His weathered eyes moved slowly from Adelaide to Gideon. Victor, Hank said carefully. The woman said the man fixed her hip. Victor laughed again, louder this time. That's the story she told you. Hank didn't smile. I've seen a dislocated hip before, he said. People scream like hell when it happens. Adelaide's voice came quietly from the doorway. I did. Victor turned sharply toward her. You need to stop talking. But Adelaide didn't look away. For the first time since the riders arrived, something inside her had changed. Fear was still there, but anger had begun to grow beside it. You left me there, she said. You knew that wagon axle was cut. Victor's jaw tightened. Now the other riders were paying closer attention. One of them leaned forward slightly. You cut the axle, the man asked. Victor shot him an irritated look. Don't be stupid. But the question had already been asked, and once doubt entered a group of men, it could spread quickly. Gideon noticed it. He didn't speak. He simply watched. Victor understood what was happening too. The moment was slipping, so he changed tactic. Instead of arguing, he straightened in the saddle and spoke with calm confidence. Let's make this simple, he said. He pointed toward Adelaide. My wife comes back with me tonight. Then he nodded toward Gideon. And the mountain man can explain his story to the sheriff tomorrow. The offer sounded reasonable. That was exactly why Victor said it. But Gideon knew better. Men like Victor Moore didn't drag groups of riders up a mountain at night just to wait for a sheriff in the morning. Adelaide seemed to realize the same thing. If I go back with you, she said quietly, I'll never make it to that sheriff. Victor smiled again. You always did have an imagination. The wind shifted across the hillside. One of the lantern flames flickered violently. Hank looked from Victor to Adelaide once more. Then he spoke slowly. You saying you locked her in the cellar? Victor's patience snapped slightly. I said she needed time to think. Hank frowned. That's not the same thing. Victor turned sharply in the saddle. You planning to argue with me now? Hank raised one hand calmly. I'm just asking questions. The tension between the riders thickened. Gideon could see something important happening. Victor Moore had ridden up the mountain expecting loyalty, but loyalty in the West could weaken when a man's temper showed too much. Adelaide saw it too. Her voice grew stronger. "He beat me," she said. "He tried to make me sign the river land over to him." Victor's face darkened. "You should really stop talking." But Adelaide kept going. "My father left that land to me." Now one of the younger riders spoke. "The river land." Victor didn't answer him. He was staring directly at Adelaide. Gideon had seen that look before in violent men. The moment they stopped pretending, Victor slowly swung his leg over the saddle and stepped down onto the ground. The dirt crunched beneath his boots. That small sound made the entire scene tighten. The other riders remained mounted. Hank leaned slightly forward. "Victor," he said quietly. Victor ignored him. Instead, he walked a few steps closer toward the cabin porch, not rushing, just slow, confident. His hand rested loosely near his revolver. Adelaide felt her heartbeat pounding in her chest. Gideon shifted his rifle slightly, still not aiming, but ready. Victor stopped a few yards from the porch steps. Then he spoke calmly. "You really think these men are going to take the word of a runaway wife and a mountain hermit over mine?" His eyes moved across the riders behind him. One by one, the pressure in the moment grew heavier, because Victor Moore wasn't just asking a question. He was reminding them who controlled the land, the water, the business in the valley. Finally, Victor looked back at Gideon. "You've lived alone too long," he said. "You forgot how towns work." Gideon answered quietly, "No." Victor raised an eyebrow. Gideon met his gaze. "I remember exactly how towns work. That's why men like you fear daylight." The lanterns flickered again in the wind. Down in the valley, far below the mountains, another faint light appeared on the distant road. A single rider, coming fast. None of the men on the mountain had noticed yet, but Gideon had, and something about that rider made him realize the night was about to become far more complicated than Victor Moore expected. For the first time that night, Gideon felt the balance shift, not toward safety, not yet, but away from the easy kind of lie that ends with a rope before dawn. Somebody else was riding into this story now, and that meant Victor Moore might finally have to face more than fear and gossip. Down in Laramie, the rumor had spread too fast, even for a rough town, and Deputy Silas Carter had heard enough to know that if he waited until morning, he might be riding up to a lynching instead of the truth. The rider in the valley was coming fast. Gideon Blackwood could see it clearly now. A single lantern bouncing in the darkness far below, moving up the narrow trail that wound toward the mountain. Whoever it was, they were pushing their horse hard. Victor Moore had not noticed yet. He was still standing in the dirt a few yards from the porch, staring at Gideon like a man who believed he had already won. "You remember how towns work," Victor said slowly. "Then you know how this ends." Gideon didn't answer. Instead, his eyes flicked once more toward the distant rider. The lantern was climbing the trail quickly now. Too quickly for someone simply passing through. Victor followed Gideon's gaze. "What are you looking at?" Gideon nodded toward the valley. Victor turned his head slightly. At first, he saw nothing. Then the moving light caught his attention. The riders behind him noticed it too. Hank leaned forward in the saddle. "Someone's riding up late," he muttered. Victor frowned. He hadn't expected company. The trail that climbed toward Gideon's cabin wasn't a common road. Most people had no reason to ride this far into the hills after dark. The lantern moved closer. The sound of hooves began to echo faintly against the rocks. The horse was running. Whoever the rider was, they were in a hurry. Adelaide gripped the doorframe tighter. Her hip still throbbed, but she hardly felt it now. Everything about the moment felt sharp, uncertain. Victor glanced at the other men. "You expecting someone?" "Blackwood." Gideon shook his head. "No." The rider was halfway up the trail now. Lantern light bounced wildly as the horse climbed the rocky slope. Hank squinted into the darkness. Then something about the shape of the rider made him stiffen slightly. "I think I know that horse," he said. Victor looked back at him. "What?" Hank didn't answer yet. The rider was too far away to be sure, but the way the horse moved looked familiar. A horse that had been pushed hard all evening. The hooves grew louder, closer. Adelaide felt her pulse pounding in her ears. Victor Moore didn't like surprises. That much was obvious now. He stepped back toward his horse and rested one hand on the saddle. The other hand drifted once again toward the revolver at his side. The rider reached the final bend of the trail. Lantern light spilled across the rocks as the horse burst into view. Dust clung to its legs. Foam flecked its mouth. The rider pulled hard on the reins. The horse slid to a stop in the dirt just below the porch. For a second, nobody spoke. The rider leaned forward in the saddle, breathing hard. Then he lifted the lantern. The light fell across his face. Hank let out a low breath. "Well, I'll be damned." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Who is it?" Hank answered quietly. "That's Silas." Victor's expression changed instantly. Silas Carter was the deputy sheriff in Laramie, and deputies didn't usually ride into the mountains alone at night unless something serious had happened. Silas swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the ground hard. His coat was dusty, his face tired. He looked like a man who had ridden straight through the evening without stopping. Silas glanced quickly at the group of riders. Then his eyes landed on Gideon. "Blackwood." His voice carried the steady tone of a lawman used to walking into tense situations. Victor stepped forward slightly. "Deputy?" Silas looked at him briefly. "I heard you were riding up this way." Victor folded his arms. "You here to stop me from collecting my wife?" Silas looked toward Adelaide standing in the doorway. His eyes lingered on the bruises across her arms. Then he looked back at Victor. "I heard some other things, too." Victor's jaw tightened. "Oh." Silas nodded slowly. "Word reached town about that wagon." Adelaide held her breath. Victor forced a calm smile. "Yeah, terrible accident." Silas shook his head slightly. "That's not what the man who examined it said." The silence that followed felt heavy. Victor's eyes narrowed. "What man?" Silas answered calmly. "The blacksmith. He said the axle wasn't broken." Silas paused. "It was cut." Hank shifted in his saddle again. Now all the riders were looking toward Victor. Victor's smile had disappeared completely. "You rode all the way up here to tell us that?" he asked. Silas studied him for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. "No." His eyes moved toward Gideon. "There's more." Gideon remained still on the porch. Silas continued. "The blacksmith also said something else." Victor's hand tightened slowly on the saddle. "What?" Silas looked directly at him now. "He said the wagon axle wasn't cut with a small blade." Victor didn't respond. Silas finished the sentence. "It was cut with a ranch saw. The kind every large ranch kept in their tool shed, and the kind used every day at the Moore Ranch." The wind moved softly through the dark hills. No one spoke, because in that moment, everyone standing on that mountain understood something. This was no longer just a rumor about a mountain man and another man's wife. Now there was evidence, and evidence had a way of turning a story completely upside down. Victor Moore looked slowly from Silas to Gideon, then toward Adelaide. And for the first time that night, the confidence in his eyes began to crack. Because if the truth kept riding up this mountain, the way Silas Carter just had, Victor Moore was about to face something he had not expected at all. A fight he could not win with lies alone. Silas Carter's words hung in the cold air like a slow-moving storm. The wagon axle had been cut with a ranch saw. Not broken, not worn out, cut. The kind of saw every ranch used for lumber and fence posts. And every man standing on that mountain knew exactly which ranch owned the wagon that Adelaide Moore had been riding in. Victor Moore didn't move for a few seconds. But Gideon Blackwood noticed something small. Victor's shoulders had tightened. Just slightly. The confidence he carried up that mountain had begun to crack. Silas stepped forward a few paces, the lantern light brushing across his dusty coat. He looked tired, like a man who had ridden hard without stopping, but his voice remained steady. "The blacksmith in town took a look at the wagon before I left," Silas said. "He told me that axle didn't break on the road." Hank shifted again in his saddle. One of the younger riders muttered under his breath. Victor finally spoke. "You rode all the way up here because a blacksmith gave you a guess." Silas shook his head slowly. "It wasn't a guess." Victor's jaw tightened. Silas continued. "He said the cut was clean, the kind you make when the wagon's standing still." The wind moved across the mountain slope. Lantern flames flickered. No one said anything for a moment, because the picture forming in everyone's mind was suddenly much darker. Victor Moore had told them his wife had run away. But if the wagon axle had been cut before the trip even started, Then the story changed. A lot. Victor looked toward the other riders. Some of them were already avoiding his eyes. That irritated him, so he turned the attention back where he wanted it, toward Gideon. You still haven't answered the real question, Victor said. He pointed toward the porch. Why was my wife in your cabin tonight? Adelaide stepped forward slightly. I told you. He saved my life. Victor ignored her completely. He kept staring at Gideon. You planning to keep hiding behind her words? Gideon didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke the truth. Her hip was out of place. Victor laughed harshly. Convenient. Silas spoke again. I've seen that injury. Victor glanced toward him. Silas nodded toward Adelaide. If he hadn't fixed it, she wouldn't be standing right now. Victor could feel the moment slipping, so he did what hard men do when truth starts cornering them. He pushed harder. You all believe this story, he said to the riders behind him. You believe my wife just happened to end up alone with Blackwood and he was playing doctor? The younger rider looked uncertain. Hank spoke first. She's standing, Victor snapped back. So? Hank shrugged slowly. My sister dislocated her hip once. Took 2 men to set it. Victor glared at him. But the seed of doubt had already grown. Gideon remained silent on the porch. He understood something important. The more Victor talked, the worse Victor sounded. Silas turned slightly toward Adelaide. Ma'am, he said calmly, did your husband leave you in that wagon knowing the axle was cut? Adelaide didn't hesitate this time. Yes. Victor's head snapped toward her. You better think real hard before you keep talking. But Adelaide was past fear now. Something had changed inside her since the moment Gideon pulled her from the wagon. Maybe it was the pain. Maybe it was the humiliation. Or maybe it was simply the first time in months someone had treated her like a human being. You locked me in the cellar, she said clearly. You beat me when I refused to sign the river land over. Victor's eyes darkened. You keep saying that like it matters. Silas looked at him carefully. It matters, Victor laughed. You know how many husbands discipline their wives around here. That sentence landed badly, even in a rough frontier valley. There were lines a man was not supposed to say out loud. Hank slowly shook his head. That ain't discipline. Victor turned on him. You planning on judging me now? Hank answered calmly. I'm just listening. Silas stepped closer to Victor. His voice stayed level. You might want to ride back down the mountain tonight. Victor stared at him. That a threat? Silas shook his head. No. A suggestion. Victor's hand drifted again toward his revolver. The lantern light caught the metal for a moment. Gideon's rifle lifted slightly on the porch, not aiming. Just enough. Everyone there noticed. The mountain air grew tight again. Victor looked slowly from Silas to Gideon, then to Adelaide. For the first time that night, the situation had shifted away from him. And Victor Moore didn't like losing control, so he did something dangerous. He smiled, slow, cold. Then he spoke quietly. You think this is over? No one answered. Victor climbed back onto his horse. The leather saddle creaked softly. He gathered the reins and looked down at Adelaide one last time. You can stay up here tonight, he said. His voice carried a strange calm now. But tomorrow morning the whole valley will hear the story. His eyes moved to Gideon. And when enough men believe a story, they don't wait for deputies. He turned the horse slowly. The other riders hesitated for a moment. Then, one by one, they followed him down the trail. Lanterns began to drift away into the darkness. Silas remained standing near the porch, watching them disappear. The mountain grew quiet again. Adelaide let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Gideon lowered the rifle. Silas rubbed the back of his neck. That man ain't finished, he said. Gideon nodded. No. Down in the valley, the lantern lights were already spreading apart along different trails, different directions, different ranches, different towns. And if Victor Moore kept his promise, by sunrise half the county would believe the same ugly story. A mountain man, another man's wife, and a night alone in the hills, which meant the real trouble was not the riders who had just left. The real trouble would arrive tomorrow, with far more men and far more rope. The lantern lights slowly disappeared into the valley. One by one they faded behind the hills until the mountain was quiet again. Gideon Blackwood stood on the porch for a long moment. Looking down the dark trail where Victor Moore and the others had ridden away, he knew something simple. The danger had not passed. It had only begun. By morning, Silas would ride back to Laramie with more than rumor. He would carry a witness, a wound, and the first hard proof that Victor Moore had lied. Victor could still stir up a crowd, but he could no longer control the whole story by himself. For the first time since Adelaide had been thrown into that wagon, the truth had found a way to stand up beside her. Behind him, Adelaide sat carefully on the chair near the cabin door, her injured hip resting stiffly but steady now. The pain was still there. But something else had changed inside her. For the first time in months, she was not locked in a cellar, not ordered, not silenced. The night air moved softly through the pines above the cabin. Deputy Silas Carter leaned against the railing and looked toward Gideon. "You did the right thing fixing that hip," he said. Gideon gave a small shrug. "Seemed like the only thing to do." Silas nodded. Funny thing about the right thing, sometimes it costs more than the wrong one. And if there is something this story shows us, it is exactly that. Doing the right thing does not always make life easier. Sometimes it puts you right in the middle of trouble. Gideon Blackwood could have ridden past that broken wagon. He could have told himself it was none of his business. No witness, no responsibility. But he stopped. He knelt in the dust. He fixed a broken joint while knowing very well how it might look to the wrong pair of eyes. And because he chose compassion instead of convenience, his life was now tangled in a fight he never asked for. That is something worth thinking about. How many times in life do we walk past someone who needs help simply because helping them might cause problems for us? How often do we stay quiet when the truth would make things uncomfortable? I find myself thinking about that when I look at Gideon standing on that porch. Because in truth, most of us are not so different from the people in this story. We live in towns. We hear rumors. We make quick judgment. Sometimes we believe the loudest voice instead of the honest one. And sometimes a good person can stand alone while the crowd believes the wrong story. But here's the part that matters. The truth does not disappear just because lies travel faster. The truth simply waits. Adelaide Moore looked toward Gideon quietly. She knew something now that the whole valley didn't yet understand. The man everyone whispered about as dangerous had saved her life without asking for anything in return. Not money, not gratitude, not even trust. Just the simple act of helping someone who was hurt. That kind of character is rare in any century. And it raises a question for anyone listening to this story tonight. When life puts you in a moment like that broken wagon in the prairie, what kind of person will you choose to be? Will you ride past, or will you stop? Another question is just as important. When you hear a story about someone else, will you believe the loudest rumor? Or will you wait for the truth? Because towns, families, communities, they rise or fall based on those choices. I've always believed that stories like this are not really about the past. They are about the kind of people we decide to become. If you ask me personally, the moment that stayed with me most was not the gun on Victor Moore's hip. It was the moment Gideon knelt beside that wagon, knowing exactly how it would look to anyone passing by. He knew people might misunderstand. He knew rumors might spread, and he helped her anyway. That kind of courage is quiet, but it is powerful. It reminds us that character is not proven when life is easy. Character shows itself when doing the right thing costs something. So I will leave you with a few thoughts tonight. Think about the last time you had the chance to help someone. Did you take it? Think about the last rumor you heard about someone. Did you repeat it? Or did you pause and ask whether it was fair? And think about this. If you had been riding that prairie road that evening and seen Gideon Blackwood kneeling beside that wagon, what would you have believed? The truth, or the story that looked easier? If this story meant something to you tonight, support the channel. You can help simply by liking the video and subscribing so more stories like this can reach people who enjoy them. Every small action helps keep these stories alive. And if you feel like sharing something personal, tell me in the comments. What lesson from this story stayed with you the most? Because sometimes the best part of a story is not the ending. It is the reflection it leaves behind. The mountains around Gideon's cabin would grow quiet again by morning. But the choices made that night would travel much farther than those riders ever expected. Because sometimes the smallest moment of courage can change the story of an entire town. And maybe even the story of our own lives.